All right, welcome out to the very first Anthro Friday seminar for the semester. I guess we need to adjust our time to 4 o'clock in the future to accommodate for the 101 contingent that teaches at
Empire.
The Empire, yes. Jacob's minions.
The evil 101 Empire.
Yes, exactly. But I thought today, since we're opening, I thought we might open with a prayer. And I asked Andrea Rain to give the opening prayer. You're welcome to come up or whatever.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this opportunity to come together as students of faculty and learners to listen to this lecture by Christine, and we're grateful for the many opportunities that we have at this university, and particularly this semester. We pray that Thou will bless us in our endeavors to learn and to share our learning with those around us, and we pray for Thy Spirit at this time, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So just a brief introduction about Christine. Currently assistant professor at Cal State, University of Long Beach. Does sociocultural and medical anthropology. I know there's some people interested in medical anthropology. I think we have a nice contingent over here. And child mental health. Did the clinical track at Chicago's Department for Comparative Human Development. Some of you may have heard about that too. Somewhere along the way, some people here connected to it. And she does research obviously in Morocco. And maybe I'll just give the title of her talk and turn it over to her. Well, you see the title of her talk here. Care and Neglect, Corporal Discipline, Reform in a Rural Moroccan Classroom. So let's give a warm welcome to Christine.
Thank you all, and I want to thank Greg Thompson and the entire Department of Anthropology here at BYU for inviting me out to talk this afternoon. Thank you to all of you for coming on a Friday afternoon to listen to some of my, listen to me talk about part of my work. And so today I'm going to talk to you about the practice of corporal punishment in schools in rural Morocco, and specifically how a national ban on corporal punishment has been understood and implemented, or not implemented, as the case often is, in one Moroccan village that I'm going to call Ouardani, which is a pseudonym for the village that where I studied, or did my field work. Okay. This is a photograph of the village, and I'll talk a little bit more about the setting. But first I want to start with a little vignette to kind of get you into the problem and to show you some of the classroom dynamics at the time when I was doing my field work. So Mehdi was constantly getting into trouble. He was one of the first grade students in the rural Moroccan primary school where I conducted 2 years of dissertation fieldwork. One day he came to the class late, an act that often led teachers to beat the hands of their students with a stick or even slap them in classrooms. On this particular day, the teacher, Si Tazi, sternly pointed a stick at him and said, "Come here, come here." Mehdi looked afraid as he walked over to Si Tazi, who angrily glared at him. He continued to glare, pulling Mehdi's face towards him, and then suddenly turned his head to look up Mehdi's nose instead, causing the whole classroom to burst into laughter. Si Tazi then told him to sit down and playfully kicked him on his back as he walked away. So these kinds of disciplinary episodes were very common in Si Tazi's classroom, and yet they were surprising in that they never involved any serious acts of corporal punishment where children were painfully or angrily hit or subjected to the teacher's kind of forceful physical intervention, which was really common throughout Morocco at this time. At the same time, these disciplinary practices do not fall within the scope of disciplinary practices that are now being promoted by Moroccan educational reformers, which are largely based on French or other kinds of Western models of non-physical consequences or kind of behavioral rewards and consequences types of discipline for misbehavior and poor performance, despite the fact that Si Tazi had completed training in a French school. Instead, Si Tazi drew upon an alternative understanding of corporal discipline, often exercised in local rural households, that emphasize the playful and even affectionate potentials of corporal discipline, in both avoiding inflicting excessive pain and fear on students, while also maintaining his authority in the classroom. And so despite the fact that corporal discipline has historically been used as a common technique of discipline and pedagogy in Moroccan schools, the Moroccan Ministry of Education banned these practices in classrooms in 2000. This ban was part of an attempt to improve a school system that consistently ranks amongst the very worst in the world by international organizations. The ban on hitting in the classrooms has been virtually ignored, however, and this is certainly the case in Ouardani. There, non-compliance with the ban reflects a dissonance between the characterization of corporal discipline or corporal punishment, I use those terms interchangeably, in transnational discourse as intrinsically harmful and violent, and a local understanding of corporal discipline as an idiom of care and protection. And so the parents and students with whom I lived often felt ambivalent about practices of corporal punishment in the school. In everyday talk about education and child rearing, they emphasized the importance of corporal punishment to the process of learning, and lamented the perceived decline in the practice. Whenever children reported to their parents that they had received some kind of corporal punishment in the school, however, the parents almost always interpreted these events as excessive and harmful to some extent. Not all the teachers wholeheartedly support corporal discipline either, as we saw in the case with Sitazi, and they are able to skillfully transform their disciplinary practices into something that avoids pain and force but retains local significance sometimes. So in this talk, I want to first look at the rationale behind the ban, then turn to why the ban has only been marginally implemented at the local level, and then finally I want to examine the significance of Sitazi's classroom disciplinary practices, which reflects both the local understandings of discipline and transnational discourse about violence and corporal punishment. So what I'm going to argue is that in this context, corporal punishment is not a practice that simply produces obedience in a particular student, but it's also an idiom that can be used to make claims about authority and care, as well as it's a practice that produces a lot of ambivalence towards authority, as all cases of corporal punishment do in Morocco, I would argue. So as such, it's actually used to make claims about the relationship between rural citizens and the state as represented by the teachers. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of the theoretical framework, I'm drawing on the anthropological literature of globalization of education and pedagogy. This literature has often examined how Western beliefs about the child and learning and mental health which are rooted in the psychological sciences, for the most part, are incorporated into non-Western classroom settings, according to the larger socioeconomic and cultural dynamics of specific contexts. A lot of this literature has emphasized the way in which the modernizing trends in pedagogy are unevenly adapted and transformed in local contexts, and sometimes categorically rejected. So transnational organizations have been trying to promote a ban on corporal punishment across the globe as part of larger global initiatives to end global violence against women and children. And engaging with both transnational discourses about corporal punishment and local village reactions to these ideas, I'm also drawing upon a Foucauldian notion of biopower, which highlights the ways in which the state, and in this case transnational governing bodies as well, are using bodily practices and disciplinary mechanisms to try to create and manage specific types of citizen subjects. So in my case, the Moroccan state, exerting its influence through the Ministry of Education, is promoting medical and legal discourses rooted in a liberal tradition of human rights that characterizes the threats of physical coercion and the infliction of pain and injury sustained during acts of corporal punishment to be forms of child abuse, with the potential to cause a great deal of long-lasting harm in the child. These discourses, in my view problematically, often assume that corporal discipline is practiced in the same way and generates the same kinds of meanings and emotional responses in children across cultural contexts. embedded in these anti-corporal punishment discourses are assumptions that the underlying subjective experiences that corporal punishment generates in children, specifically pain, anger, and aggression, shame, and fear, are harmful to the child and the greater social good. As cultural anthropologists have demonstrated, however, the way in which child abuse is conceptualized and corporal punishment is practiced does vary considerably across cultures and historical contexts as well, as does the meaning that children and their caretakers ascribe to these practices. This literature has not tended to focus on the ways in which the practice of corporal punishment is attached to larger systems of power and authority. And so my contribution is kind of focusing explicitly on the notion of biopower and the way in which the Moroccan state is attempting to discipline student and teacher bodies, really, into new modes of authority that emphasize collaboration and critical thinking over submission and obedience. I want to show how the globalization of pedagogy can become a commentary on the relationships between citizen and state and implicated in larger relationships of inequality, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But just to give you a little bit of context about where I was. So Morocco is located in the northwest corner of Africa, directly below Spain. And I spent 2 years conducting ethnographic research in this village that had about 3,000 villagers, and about 2,000 of them were under the age of 18. So the average family had about 6 to 7 children in this village, which was great for me because I was studying childhood and socialization, and there were just tons of kids running around all over the place, and ample opportunities for me to participate and observe all day. So Tatani, like most Moroccans, speak a dialect of Arabic known as Darija, which is not comprehensible to most of the Arab world, actually. It's kind of a combination of French and Berber and Arabic, and it's very specific to the Moroccan context. The country is like 99.9% Sunni Muslim as well, with a very small Jewish minority, mostly in the city of Casablanca. But there used to be, but there are no longer any Jewish people in the village where I studied. Okay. So the primary school, this is a photograph of the primary school, opened in 1999 at a time when the Ministry of Education was opening up hundreds of new primary schools all over the country in an effort to make schooling more accessible to these kids in these marginalized remote regions. So Douar Tatani is generally a very poor farming community. Most of the adults in the village are illiterate, having little to no formal education. Because the post-colonial national policies favor the development of urban regions over that of modernizing farming, which has been the case in much of the world, this has meant the continuing impoverishment and marginalization of most of the rural population in Morocco in general, and certainly in this region as well. So urbanites in the media often characterize the Arabic-speaking people who came from or lived in this countryside, which is around the city of Fez, right in the middle of the country. And they were collectively known as the Arabia. They characterized them as backwards, underdeveloped, stupid, and even subhuman. I often heard references to the Arabia as being like animals. These representations of the Arabia depicted them as living in squalor, in the countryside with little or no education, and with few rules to govern their behavior. So they were sort of seen as immoral in a lot of senses, backwards, too beholden to traditional modes of patriarchal authority, that kind of thing. So Tatani parents really wanted their children to receive a good education, as they saw this as one of the only ways out of their marginalized status. So here's a photograph of one of the girls in the household that I lived with, getting ready for school, and her mom, every morning washing the kids and getting them ready for school. It was really important to her, and she spent a lot of time kind of invested in trying to make her children look presentable for school. So the association of illiteracy and lack of education with being Arabia is probably the most stigmatizing quality about being from the countryside. And in some ways, that's almost what defines the Arabia as the stigmatized group, that they don't have education, they're not educated, therefore they're immoral, they don't know how to follow the religion properly, and there's all these kinds of associations around education in particular that make this particular group, quote unquote, like subhuman, according to a lot of the more elite people in Morocco that I talked to. So for the Tatanis and the Arabia more generally, the stakes are particularly high in any sort of school reform because they see education as one of the few ways out of their marginal status and the material poverty that they live in. The process of formal knowledge acquisition in Duar Tatani is especially significant to villagers because of its power to transform their moral and social status. So here, you can see the girls about to go off to school. Becoming formally educated, or Qari as you say in Darija, is an important part of becoming a moral person and garnering the respect of others, as well as one of the few ways, again, to improve one's economic situation in contemporary Morocco. And so these parents went to great lengths to ensure a formal education for their kids, even though, you know, in the cities they'd say, oh, those rural people, they don't care about their kids' education. That was not the case. They were deeply invested in education. But the teachers expressed many frustrations to me about their attempts to teach the Tatani students. The first and second grade classes were completely overcrowded with up to 55 students who had never before set foot in a classroom because there's no preschool or kindergarten. Because they hadn't attended kindergarten, they had to introduce the students to really basic norms of behavior in the classroom, like how to sit in a chair and sit still, hold a pencil, you know, stand in line. That was really tough to teach to these kids. And there was almost no communication between parents and children at all. Because the parents were largely illiterate, they couldn't help their kids with their homework at all, and this was seen as particularly problematic from the perspective of the teachers. So given these circumstances, most of the Tatani children might attend school for a few years, but they almost all drop out before the 5th grade. Very few students make it to middle school, and they have to go to the school or to in the city or pretty far away in the countryside. This was one of the boys in the household that I lived in who actually did end up making it through middle school and even into a little bit of high school before he was forced out by this kind of political drama that happened in the village. But that he is sort of doing his homework in not the ideal conditions, but somehow made it to pass the 5th grade. These kids who go on to the middle school in the city found really challenging circumstances because they weren't as prepared as their urban counterparts, and they faced a lot of stigma coming from the countryside. So that, again, the daily material conditions and the state policies in this region make it really difficult to function. Okay, just to give you a really quick overview of the research design, I spent 2.5 years of doing ethnographic fieldwork in Morocco as part of a larger study that looks at mental health and socialization practices with kids. And as part of that project, I spent 2 years or 11 months conducting participant observation in the local school. And I observed all 3 classrooms in that school at different times. I also conducted informal interviews with teachers, principals, local education officials, as well as the semi-structured interviews with students and parents, where we discussed their experiences with the local school, in addition to lots of other topics like child-rearing practices in the home, family life, play, work, peer relationships. We just covered the whole, in 2 years we covered a lot of ground with these folks. And I had lots of informal, people talked about the education system all the time because it was such a concern to them. And so I would always hear complaints about the teachers. For the teachers, I hear complaints about the students and the parents, and so it was this kind of daily discourse that I was, recording and hearing, and then more formally recording in the interviews and in material that I would collect, news articles and different kinds of materials I collected from the Ministry of Education. Okay. So given the fact that transnational organizations concerned with economic and social development generally rank Morocco quite high, they're actually ranked very high on a whole range of development measures like health, demographics, governance, women's rights. It looks very surprising that their school system is consistently ranked as one of the lowest in the world. And in the region of the Middle East and North Africa, it's only ranked above Yemen, which is a much, much poorer country. So the reform of the Moroccan school system is one of the most pressing and vexing problems facing the Moroccan government in the contemporary moment. And partly in response to what the government sees as really embarrassing findings like this, government officials have been trying to enact a host of initiatives to reform pedagogy in the national curriculum, to some extent. This is a photograph of some of the local men coming together to discuss problems with the school and try to come up with some solutions. So, you know, they try to involve local actors, a very small amount, and this is one of the cases where they were coming together to try to, you know, have a meeting about what to do about the local school. So the reforms are generally designed to inculcate skills in children that are perceived to be essential for the development of the Moroccan workforce, especially introducing kind of pedagogical techniques that encourage critical thinking and analytic skills and individual initiative, creative problem solving, and cooperative group work. So these techniques require a significant change in prior structures of authority in the schools, which emphasize submission to the teacher and were largely focused just on memorization, like kind of rote memorization. And these new skills require children to be able to question authority and kind of interact with teachers in cooperative and flexible ways, which is something that corporal punishment is directly at odds with. Right? From the perspective of the reformers, who draw again upon a lot of American and French theorists, I heard Durkheim a lot from these reformers. They talked about Durkheim a lot. Of pedagogy, corporal punishment is also ineffective, degrading, and encourages students to be violent against their peers, and is generally just uncivilized. UNICEF is heavily involved in this effort, and they wrote, along with some Moroccan collaborators, a 2008 report looking at the state of corporal punishment in Morocco, and they clearly located the anti-corporal punishment initiatives within a rights-based political order associated with the emergence of a liberal democracy. So they're directly tying corporal punishment to a better liberal democracy. In fact, in this report, they asserted that reducing the problem of violence in society is central to the promotion of liberal democracy, stating, quote, "In the last several years, Morocco has shown signs of an increase in engagement towards the creation of a democratic society that fights against violence," end quote, and that this was going to be, you know, the next step in that process. Government officials and also children and parents in the village also associate corporal punishment with high dropout rates. That seems almost incontestable because so many kids told me they dropped out of school because they were just hit too much and there was too much hitting and beating going on. So the ban on corporal punishment has been really difficult to implement, and about 87% of the students still report, this was 8 years after the ban, that they're still being hit in school, and 73% of teachers admitted to still hitting students. So even the teachers are not particularly concerned with the fact of admitting that they're still doing these practices, which suggests that it continues to be widespread and systemic in the context and that there's no consequences. Anecdotally, teachers told me when they went to the teachers' college that my sister-in-law is actually a teacher in Morocco, and she told me that she was taught to beat one child very badly at the beginning of the year in order to dissuade any bad behavior. And they're like, then you won't have to use your energy to beat the kids all the time. Just beat one of them up badly and be done with it. Which she did. She said it was effective, but you know, we'll talk about why, more like the logic of why that.
I'm gonna try that in my first session.
So indeed, few teachers I talked, and none of the teachers in this village, except for this one that I talked about, complied with the ban. Okay. So this is one of the teachers in Ouardani who really thought that corporal punishment was a good idea. So she was very nice in other contexts, but yeah, she was a fan. Corporal discipline was again common in the classrooms I observed, and very few children were spared painful interactions. I mean, sometimes the first day when I observed the second grade classroom, the teacher went around to see who had done the homework, and if she felt that If the child hadn't done their homework, and again, this is a household, these households have no pens or pencils or anything like that, so these kids don't really have any access to tools to do their homework. Or if she felt that someone else had done the homework for them, she would like hit them 2 or 3 times on the hand, like in a matter-of-fact way. And so every child in this classroom ended up getting hit by the end of the class. And they were all crying and subdued, but she felt that she had done her job. So, let's see. I had observed that children being slapped in the face, which in general is considered not to be, and nobody supports that. No parents that I talked to supported that as a technique. Hitting on the head, slapping on the face, things like this are generally considered to be out of bounds. They were hit with sticks, with rubber tubing on the hands, back, on the head. Teachers hit students for not doing their homework or bringing the correct supplies to class, not being able to answer questions or read text in the classroom, being late for class, talking during class, not paying attention. So the normal things that kids are disciplined for in the classroom. But why do so many teachers value corporal discipline as a pedagogical technique to the point that they are unwilling to comply with this ban? I'm going to argue that it has to do with the local logics of discipline that are obscured in the human rights discourses. So corporal discipline is explicitly articulated in the local discourses of childbearing as a deterrent that discourages children from participating in disobedient, rude, or immoral behavior through the association of pain with that behavior. So Tatanis, the parents and even the kids in this village, often talked about corporal discipline in terms of their rural identity as Arubia as well, even when they chose not to corporally discipline their own kids. Because not everybody used physical, even if they would say that they supported corporal punishment, only about, I would say, 2/3 of the parents that I interviewed actually used corporal punishment in the household. So they lamented, the discourse that I would often hear in Tatan is that they lamented what they viewed as a breakdown in the proper relations of authority in urban Morocco and Western societies. In particular, the lack of respect that children demonstrated towards their parents. And they made fun of what they viewed as the unwarranted coddling of children in these contexts. They viewed painful disciplinary practices as cultivating social order in the household and rightful relations of authority between parents, and especially the father and child, and developing strong, moral, and well-behaved children. So this is a photo I put up. It kind of illustrates some of the principles. This is one of the patriarchs in the family, in the extended family that I lived with, and his wife and some of their kids and his sister. And so, it was very, again, the patriarchal authority is really key in this context. And when Moroccans talk about beating as idiomatic of relationships of patriarchal authority, and experience being subject to this type of authority with some degree of ambivalence. Patriarchal authority is an organizing principle of social life in Morocco, and yet it's also contested in everyday interactions. So according to this principle, in the intimate sphere of the family, the fathers have absolute authority over their wives, their unmarried sisters, and children. Although in reality, there's actually a huge range of different practices of discipline and authority within families. And in the household that I lived in for a time, the mother actually really was the disciplinarian and had a lot, was the one that made decisions. And within an idealized discourse of patriarchal authority, however, the father is charged with the care and protection of his subordinates, while they in turn owe him their obedience and labor. So violence, care, and protection then become the primary ways through which the father can enforce this authority. Again, corporal discipline is administered and received with a certain degree of ambivalence, however. Beating, when it's enacted within rightful relationships of authority, is desirable, and it indexes care and protection, a connection that these villagers constantly made in a discourse. He beats me because he loves me, this kind of thing. Like it's, when I would ask kids, does it bother you that your father hits you? And they'd say, yes, but he buys me things and protects me against all these other people who are trying to hurt me. And so that was the kind of discourse that I would hear. The inverse of the right to hit children is the responsibility then to protect and provide for these same children. And so parents and other kin who physically discipline specific children ideally protected these same children when they were threatened by others and provided for them materially. Children also contested almost every instance of corporal discipline in the household that I observed, though, when they were actually being hit, and can often encourage this resistance to their own discipline, so they were both encouraging submission and resistance at the same time, which I argue in other work has a lot to do with their rural identity again, as strong, being strong and being able to withstand pain, being able to fight back. So one of the ways in which this ambivalent authority and care is conveyed to children in their extended families is through the playful and humorous enactment of corporal punishment. So both physical and verbal features of corporal punishment become a source of play and humor for both adults and children in Ouardani. Adults often joked with children, either in teasing them with violent threats or playfully disciplining them, hitting and pinching them, sometimes with equal intensity as when they were actually angrily disciplining their children, but while enacting a playful and humorous affect. So for example, 3-year-old Munir, who I have in this photograph with his father here, was playing noisily with some shoes in the corner of one of the common rooms of the house. After some time, his mother grabbed him and lightly slapped him on the head a few times for being so loud. Munir laughed, and his mother responded by also laughing, and they started playing a game together where she would slap him and he would slap her back. So the fact that the hitting can contain two potential affective possibilities, on the one hand, play and affection, and on the other, anger, fear, and pain, allows the child to make the connection between being disciplined on the one hand and being protected and cared for on the other. At the same time, they also dislike being hit and often feel angry towards their caregivers when they're hit, even when they feel it was justified. Okay. Oh, that's kind of a blurry picture, but Moroccan teachers have traditionally often used physical discipline against children and even adult disciples in certain Sufi traditions as a technique of instilling both moral and practical knowledge in children. And parents view teachers as one of the few caregivers or few categories of non-kin who can legitimately discipline their children. This is a traditional practice of falaka, where the teacher would beat the feet of the children, which is still practiced in Morocco, both in households and in some school settings, although I never saw it. So parents consider corporal discipline to be an integral part of the process of formal education because they believed it helped students to learn content and because it reinforced ideas about submitting to rightful authority they learned at home. So teachers and parents vocalized appreciation for the fear and shame that corporal punishment evokes in children as not just a way to keep children in line and maintain order in the classroom, but it actually helps them learn their lessons more effectively. So contrary to the Western pedagogical theories which posit fear as a hindrance to the kind of cognitive processing necessary for the retention of material and the solving of complex problems, Tatanis told me that fear produced a heightened state of awareness in children and that makes them concentrate more on their studies and helps them to memorize and solve these complex problems. So they understood this as a way to help children gain basic literacy and math skills. Okay. Despite the fact that parents and children talked about punishment as theoretically an important teaching technique and a sign of care, most of them complained to me whenever they or their children reported being hit in the classroom. Parents in particular were disappointed by most of the teachers who they saw as an extension of state power and as actors who continued to exclude them from modernizing projects and basic practices of care that were readily available to urbanites, or at least the middle class urbanites. For example, the mother in the family I lived with, who was really an advocate for corporal punishment and often hit her own kids, on more than one occasion complained to me that her younger children were beaten too often and too hard by the teachers in the school, and it made them afraid to go to school. This was despite the fact that when presented with evidence of her children's lack of success in school, she would often say, "Those damn teachers, they don't hit the kids." So it was like this real contradiction in the discourse all the time. Children also reported to me that they dropped out of school because they were too afraid of the teachers. So 12-year-old Yassine told me when I asked if he, this is not the right slide. Okay, told me when I asked if he liked school before he quit at the age of 10, which I was beaten or literally ate the stick every day, and I liked school. I told my dad every day they are killing me with the beating, and I swear to God, I'm not going back there tomorrow. After that his father told him to quit school and to come and do farm work with him instead, which he did. So in Ouardani, if we can go back here, outside the rightful exercise of authority, hitting and beating become signs of transgression and a breakdown in proper relationships of authority. So legitimate corporal punishment happens in kin-based exchanges where someone has authority over another person and is providing them with care and love and protection. That is understood as a legitimate and non-harmful type, ethical, fortifying type of corporal punishment. If non-kin hit a child, it's considered immoral and hurtful and traumatic. I would often see kids hit in very similar ways by non-kin and have like traumatic reactions to that, or their parents would tell them to have traumatic like they should be traumatized by this kind of thing. And so in educational exchanges, I'm going to talk about this in a second, there are certain kinds of educational exchanges which are legitimate and others which are illegitimate. And the state compensating teachers becomes a type of illegitimate exchange for the reasons I'm going to explain right now. So we have to understand the ways in which the ideal teacher-child-parent relationship has been undermined by the current state policy. So parents and students in Ouardani believe that they should show primary school teachers respect. And yet in the contemporary moment, this function has been eroded by state action. In pre-colonial and colonial periods in Ouardani, many parents sent their boys to the local Quranic schools, which were mainly religious schools to learn Quran and to learn basic math and reading skills. These local villagers financially compensated the faqih, who's the local religious figure, who was also the teacher of the Quranic schools, by giving them wheat. This was a traditional education held in a mosque, where the faqih mainly taught the students again to memorize Quran. So each adult male, determined by who fasted for Ramadan, contributed a set amount to the faqih to pay for his religious services to the community and to the education of these boys. But now it's no longer the local men who are compensating the teachers, it's the state, and they're doing so very poorly. It's positioned itself, the state, between what the villagers imagine to have been the relationship of the faqih and the students' parents, but is not correctly compensating them or showing respect towards the teachers, causing a breakdown in this idealized exchange that was supposed to occur. So although villagers complained about the teachers, they did recognize that it was the state education policies that motivated their behavior and hindered the ability of teachers to educate children. So the conditions that the teachers had to work under were not easy. They commuted to Fez by, they commuted to the village from Fez by taxi, which took about an hour each way, and then they had to trudge up to the village sometimes in like knee-deep mud, which was another 40 minutes to an hour. They were also so the Ministry of Education assigns teachers to posts that are, I knew one woman who was sent 18 hours from her home into a Berber village where she didn't know a word of Berber and there was no one else that spoke Arabic there. And so she was there for 10 years and became really psychologically depressed because it was a terrible situation. There was a lot of violence against female teachers. There was a female teacher who was raped in the region. There was a female teacher who was kidnapped from our school. There was just a lot of problems and they were compensated very poorly for their, efforts to work in these rural, marginalized places. So one man in the village, and again, the villagers completely saw this and were horrified by it. One man said, the teachers got fed up with the situation and they're suffering. This is the worst kind of work in the whole world. I feel sorry for them, even if I should feel sorry for myself. I really feel for teachers in Morocco. So it's quite clear to most Ouardanis that the problems with the school, extended far beyond the teachers and was in fact a problem with the underdevelopment and state neglect of the countryside more generally, as well as with local attitudes. So complaints about the lack of corporal discipline or inappropriate corporal discipline thus become symbolic of the perceived state neglect of both villagers and teachers. So if we read hitting as an idiom for teaching, protecting, and caring for children here, we can see how the villagers understand the state and its preoccupation with the transnational norms they're trying to implement through these development programs as a continuation of the historical pattern of neglect in the countryside. So teachers are thus in a bind in which it's very difficult for their disciplinary actions to be read as productive or as a sign of care no matter what they do. So if they hit the kids, they're going to be understood as neglectful. If they don't hit the kids, they're understood as neglectful. But C. Tazi was different. So C. Tazi, who's the teacher I introduced at the beginning of my talk, and this is his classroom, managed to be read by parents and students as possessing legitimate authority and consistently demonstrating care towards his students. He never hit his students. He told me after reading child psychology texts and texts both from French and Arabic sources and religious texts, and based on his own experience having been trained in both Moroccan and the French systems, that this practice was detrimental to state student learning. He skillfully developed disciplinary practices that resonated with some of those local meanings of discipline, and particularly those that emphasize play, humor, and protection and care, as his playful disciplining of Mehdi's tardiness in the opening vignette suggests. So Si Hassan enacted these local forms of discipline while minimizing pain and fear involved in the practices. He often corrected behavior that was responded to by hitting in other classrooms by teasing them and making jokes. Right? When children would chew on their pens or pencils, for example, he would come up to them and ask, "Are you hungry or do you want to smoke?" When they would smile and say no, he would respond by saying, "Well, then stop chewing on your pen." Or when the students looked sleepy, he might tease them by saying, "Baraka frasik," which means I'm sorry for your loss because it seems like you're dead. Like that's the kind of the meaning there. And so, which would inevitably make everybody laugh and the student in the question perk up. He also used other kinds of playful corporal interactions, like spraying kids with a water bottle when they would start to sleep or throwing chalk at them, but always in a playful way. And the students always responded to these interactions by laughing. And the techniques were effective because it prevented students' undesirable behavior, but it also asserted his authority. It reminded students that he does possess the capacity to follow through in a painful way, in the way that they experience at home. At the same time, his authority is not absolute because students can joke with him and freely ask questions, which was really unusual in any of the classrooms I saw in Morocco. So returning to the opening vignette, soon after Mehdi was reprimanded for being late, a girl in the class piped up to tell Si Hassan that Mehdi had hit her the day before. Si Hassan approached Mehdi and pulled his face up so that he was looking directly at Si Tazi's, I changed the name to it, Si Tazi's face. He said, "Look at me. Why did you hit her yesterday?" Mehdi, who looked ashamed, shrugged his shoulders. Si Tazi then made some funny faces and told him to go stand in the corner, playfully hitting him on the back as he was getting up, which made Mehdi laugh. In this interaction, it seemed clear to me that Si Hassan, or Si Tazi, elicited affect, namely fear and shame, that could potentially dissuade Mehdi from being late and hitting his female classmates outside of school. At the same time, in each interaction, he quickly transitioned to humor, eliciting laughs from the child in the class and minimizing these shameful and fearful affective states. This kind of quick transition from fear or shame to laughter was something that children in Tatani often experienced at home, and again, reinforced that link between discipline and care. So Si Tazi abided by the ban on corporal punishment, but didn't necessarily do so by deploying Western pedagogical modes of discipline in the classroom, which would not have made sense in this context. Instead, he's drawing on another local disciplinary practice, the playful and academic discipline, to create his own techniques to enforce his authority in the classroom and manage the large number of young children in his care. Okay, so he's sort of introducing new forms of authority and affect into the classroom at this point. Students and parents also understood Si Tazi as demonstrating care towards students, and his disciplinary practices exemplified the adaptation of disciplinary practices to reflect both the local understandings of care and authority and transnational ideas about violence and trauma. This example of Si Tazi demonstrates how individual actors might adapt corporal discipline reform in the local context by drawing on local models of discipline that emphasize the symbolic, playful, and affectionate dimensions of corporal discipline. Okay, what this example shows also is that when teachers are given flexibility and space to develop disciplinary interactions and even curriculum according to the local context, They may be able to creatively adapt reforms based in foreign ideas and practices of education to be effective in the schools. This kind of teacher-led innovation was not encouraged, however, and Sitazi would constantly complain to me that he was criticized in his performance evaluations for not strictly adhering, for example, to the daily schedule and exceeding the time limits for certain subjects, even when students were clearly not understanding the concepts. So international organizations and transnational discourses about education reform have put pressure on Moroccan educational reformers and state actors to recognize corporal punishment as a practice that harms children, prevents them from learning, sometimes even dissuades them from going to school, and prevents more egalitarian types of authority from developing between students and teachers. These reformers are framing corporal punishment as a moral problem, as well as a practical problem, hindering students' educational opportunities. Schools, then, are theoretically a key institutional site for the enactment of a globalized biopolitics that aims to cultivate in children a new kind of relationship to authority that emphasizes, on the surface, democratic citizenship and a turning away from violence in interpersonal relationships, in part to ensure success in a highly competitive global marketplace. This ban, however, has clearly been difficult to enact. Many teachers and school administrators at the local level see the ban as an attempt by the Moroccan government to pander to the interests of transnational organizations that give them money for development initiatives, or as an attempt by out-of-touch officials to reform the school in a context of which they have very little understanding. Most of these teachers, along with parents and Douar Tatani, feel strongly that corporal punishment and the fear and shame it instills in students are efficacious in maintaining order in the classroom and motivating students to learn their lessons. In fact, as we saw above, parents often use a lack of corporal discipline to describe the teachers and thus the state's neglect of their children whom they're supposed to be educating. In part, these attitudes relate to the politics of authoritarianism in Morocco, which scholars have argued that infuse multiple spheres of social and political life. Within this model, legitimate authority uses both violence and affection, care and protection, or in the case of the teachers, the transmission of valuable knowledge to exact submission and obedience from his or her subordinates. When authority figures are not seen as caring for their subordinates, however, these exchanges break down and their authority is deemed illegitimate. Rural Moroccans and the lower classes more generally are often depicted as particularly invested in this model. And the fact that the 2000 ministerial ban on corporal punishment has not been enacted in Moroccan classrooms, for example, has been depicted as a consequence of the lower class population who's unwilling to participate in modernizing initiatives because of their adherence to patriarchal values and backwards traditions. And even the teachers would use the idea that, oh, the Arabia, this group of rural Moroccans, they value violence. And so that's the only thing we can do to make them understand, because that's all they know. That type of discourse was common. This cultural logic of authoritarianism also creates deep feelings of ambivalence towards authority, however, which we have seen in the contradictory stances of parents both supporting and criticizing corporal punishment in the classroom. Although the Arabia want to participate in an education system that's going to give their children opportunities to more successfully participate in national and international economy, state policies that have led to the neglect and marginalization of the Arabia have left Tatanis with a deep skepticism towards most state actors, including teachers. Corporal punishment is an idiom, then, that can stand for care, but then can also signal neglect and harm if it's practiced outside of legitimate relationships of authority. In Douar Tatani, the fact that the state is operating its national education system under conditions that make it difficult for teachers to show up regularly for class and teach properly creates conditions under which their authority is not seen as legitimate and caring them, and therefore the acts of corporal punishment are deemed as harmful. So transnational discourses promoting an end to corporal punishment everywhere in the world make assumptions about what these practices consist of: violence, pain, disordered relationships, and what they must produce, which is trauma and aggression. Failing to recognize how other meanings and effects may be produced creates conditions under which reform is difficult to enact, and people who fail to fall in line with transnational norms can become stigmatized as violent and perhaps undeserving of modernizing reforms. by focusing on individual interactions, these discourses also fail to consider the way in which larger systemic inequalities are implicated in the ways in which the reforms are implemented and interpreted. The national education system in Morocco has been developed primarily according to the needs of the urban population, and very little has been done to try to adapt the system to the rural milieu. So incorporating local actors, and especially local teachers, into the reform process at the national level would likely lead to better practices in the rural classrooms, although it seems that major structural reform is needed for more legitimate relationships of authority to be enacted between teachers, their students, and their students' parents. That's all I have. Thank you.
Do we have time for questions, comments?
Yes,
They treat the girls differently than the boys?
very good question. So in the classroom, the teachers often sees the boys as much more disruptive. And so the boys tend to get more of the corporal punishment, and especially the more severe corporal punishment. But girls were hit quite often in the classroom as well. I mean, there was a lot of violence in the classroom. In homes, girls were hit. I think this is one of the things that people are really surprised about in my fieldwork, but I found that there weren't as many gender differences as you would think in the child-rearing practices. And girls and boys were hit with almost equal frequency when they were young. When they grew up, like adolescent girls, for example, would rarely be hit, whereas adolescent boys might still be occasionally hit by their fathers if they've done something extremely. I mean, most of the time by the age of 7, the kids have kind of fallen in line and they're not, running around wild anymore. And so there's not a lot of, beating of older kids. It's mostly kind of a younger kid phenomenon. So, but girls and, the girls are, people in Tatani want girls and boys to both be strong and both be able to defend their property, defend themselves, defend their families. Yes?
I've got a couple of questions. One's related to that, but I'm going to ask that after this first one. So when you're discussing discipline and particularly corporal punishment as an idiom, I wonder about taking that comparison metaphor even further. In other words, you mentioned how many kids talk about leaving school because they just got hit so much, or that sort of thing. I'm wondering about this isn't exactly the best way to put it, how reliable you think these testimonies are. In other words, are these just a proximal explanation for, around 12, most people leave to go help on the farm anyway. And if so, if it's an idiom that is part of UNICEF, if it's part of the state government, then I'm wondering about this being, then those globalizing groups and their ideas, they filter down perhaps to where students know that this is something, kids know this is something that they can say that will resonate. That people will say, oh, well, of course, yes, because in-classroom violence is bad. This is a bad thing. We all know that. Everybody knows that. This is, it's a bad thing. Kids are they're clever, They pick up on things.
I think that's a really good question. And it actually brings up another issue too, but I think, so I'm not sure completely,
Sure.
how much they hear. I did not have the impression that they heard very much of this transnational discourse, actually. People were shocked that I was upset that kids were being hit, like when they would beat the kids. And I would get, especially at first, I would have a very visceral reaction to this and be horrified. Like, yell, stop that, you can't do that, which actually is sort of appropriate. But, and they would be like, why are you upset? And I would be like, are you serious? Like, do you not know why I'm upset? Like, this is really disturbing stuff. And
This is the
so,
teachers?
huh?
This is the teachers or parents?
Parents, with parents in particular. And so I'm not sure how much the kids, the teachers were more educated too. So the teachers were like kind of urban, lower middle class. So they would understand, like, oh yes, Westerners, you guys think that this is a bad, you don't understand. Like, you think it's a bad practice, you don't understand how, like, things work in this country, that kind of thing. But yeah, the parents and the kids too, I think, were kind of surprised, like, oh, like you're, so it made me feel like, unlike the teachers, they didn't have a good understanding of why, of these transnational discourses and like why people thought this practice was not a good thing. And even to this day, when I go back, even though we've talked about it for years and years, they're still like, you know, why don't you hit your kids like that? Like that would keep her in line, like this kind of thing.
Before you change.
Yeah.
So interesting, was it parents that were sort of saying that fear produces a heightened sense of awareness and therefore?
And the teachers too.
Isn't that actually as substantiated, like the psychological theory, it's the flashbulb theory, right? The idea that heightened emotional senses of, in heightened emotional states, you actually tend to develop more explicit awareness of memories that happen in that.
Which is like trauma theory.
Like I wonder if that's actually, I mean, I
Yeah.
don't know if that's like through a some type of circulating discourse. It seems like it's more of a ethno theory.
Yeah,
That,
no, I
that
think it
squares
is.
pretty well with a lot of psychological evidence.
I think
That's-
that was a lot of their experience too, when they were in, like, a lot of these parents were in school for like 2 years, and they were like, I remember that when I got hit, I wanted to avoid that at all costs, and I was so vigilantly focused on my lessons at that point,
Yeah.
that it was very effective, and that's how I learned. And that's why our kids are all floundering in school, because they don't have that sense of,
Keeping you on your toes.
yeah,
Paying
exactly.
attention to it.
Yes.
Just gonna make a comment. I've worked in Syria and Jordan, in 3 different villages, and as well as Damascus. And in Ottoman Damascus, even into the early modern period here, in the madrasas, new students were paraded with their parents, bringing gifts to a teacher. And in the front of the school, in front of all the other students, they would present these gifts to the teacher. And the parent, in an official ritual kind of, I'm gonna kind of paraphrase it, would say, I'm presenting my child for you to mold their brain, but I'm also, their body is also given to you to beat if necessary, you know, to have them learn. And it is so much of a cultural perception. I'm a little concerned that you're still bringing with you the Western perceptions and imposing it on a culture, you know what I'm saying? That you're still exhibiting horror at this happening. You know, there's a disconnect here between an anthropological study and you still bringing that Western UNICEF, French, Western perception of what this is all about. And secondly, we still have these issues in the United States where we have parents.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've taught in ghetto schools, and you know, when this whole trend of no corporal punishment began, and there are a lot of parents from the 60s forward now who see the chaos in schools in the United States, you know, putting their kids back in Catholic school, back in fundamentalist Christian schools because of their perceived need to have some structure and some disciplines. I just want to have you comment on that.
Sure, I'll take the first question first, I guess. And I mean, I try in my writing to be as you know, to understand but there is an ambivalence there too, and I think that I feel a lot of ambivalence towards that, and I try to recognize that in the work as well, because I think it's important to kind of show my bias in the work too, because it's there and it's not. I mean, I came to understand the. I mean, your point is well taken, but I mean, I came to understand the logic of it, and I really look at it as a kind of flexible ambivalence, you know, that they have. Like, it's not all, people aren't all pro-corporal punishment all the time, right? Like, it's a very nuanced, complex, and in my larger book, I talk a lot about the complexities of when violence is okay, or, you know, and I don't even use the term, they don't use the term violence. They don't consider this like a type of violence. And so in the book, I don't really even talk about it as a violence. It's a discipline, it's something different than what they would consider like a illegitimate act of violence. But there were certainly situations, I mean, I could see why the parents were upset.
I have the same complaints in Jordan, the same thing
Really?
going on. But I think it's very difficult for us in this culture to understand these types of cultures that are subsistence, often dependent on herding agriculture, where children from the age 3, 4 on provided some portion of what's needed to keep the family alive as far as work. And I think that presents a whole different dichotomy of behavior
And
than we're
bodies
able to
and-
comprehend
right.
sometimes because our society is completely different
Right.
right at this point.
Right. No, it's true. It's absolutely true. And I mean, I hope in my work to kind of break down some of those categories and say, like, corporal punishment is not. And this gets to the second question too, which I think in the United States, and you can even see this in the psychological studies if you go there, which I don't put a lot of faith in that kind of psychological science of, like, what does corporal punishment produce in terms of psychopathology. I think it's flawed in a lot of ways, but they've shown that different ethnic groups have very different outcomes for corporal punishment, and that the kind of white liberal middle class trauma that corporal punishment supposedly produces, you don't see that in the case of the African American middle class, for example. And I mean, this has been very controversial because then people say, well, aren't you disadvantaging the African American populations by, you know, claiming that this is okay when it's really maybe a harmful practice and all of this. I mean, it's a really complex debate in the US. But yes, I mean, corporal punishment is still legal in 13 states in the United States, in schools. It's legal in all 50 states. And we actually have a higher rate of corporal punishment in households in the United States than they do in Morocco. So corporal punishment is very, very common in the United States, especially under 5, with kids under 5. I'm not sure if that got to your question about the U.S.
Yeah, I think that we're going through a transition also,
Yeah.
you know, in trying to evaluate some of these educational trends that
Right.
began in the 60s and 70s. And, you know,
Right.
we're kind of seeing the product of that. you know.
Right. Yeah.
Can I just comment to your first point? I think you're kind of being a little coy in your position. You are clearly not supporting the UNICEF
No.
work. I mentioned to Christine last night about, you know, funding from UNICEF. She's like, I don't think I could do that because of precisely the issue that you're talking about, where it's imposing this perspective of how you should raise your children. So yeah, you were.
Yeah, no, I think these UNICEF initiatives, I mean, not even to comment on the sort of morality of it, but that they're just totally ineffective. They don't do anything, and they're just, I mean, at least in this Moroccan, and I would imagine in other
Yeah,
Middle
same
Eastern
thing.
contexts. And that actually, the ceremony with the kids and the teachers has happened in the past in Morocco, too, in certain regions. So that's like a kind of region-wide.
But it's also not a Ray Schrader style defense of like female circumcision for corporal punishment, you're right? Like it's not.
Well, but I don't think that they're not totally wholeheartedly embracing the practice either. Again,
Yeah.
fundamental to the
Well, it's not
practice.
like chronic abuse or
Right,
something. It's
exactly.
situational, it's, yeah.
And I mean, they say it's good, but then in the enactment and the practice, it's actually ambivalent. They're like, oh, I don't like this all the time, and this is not, and that's what it's not a good and bad dichotomy. I want to try to get away from the good and bad dichotomy and look at what does this produce, you know? Like what kind of person does this produce? And the argument in the bigger book is that it produces a person who's very ambivalent about authority, you know? Like, and that is so key to the context in Morocco, and I think the larger Middle East too. It's that this ambivalence constantly towards patriarchal authority, but also, you know, lots of other types of social relationships is key to the political order, to individual subjectivity, to negotiating conflict. It leads to a lot of you know, understandings of the person at the adult level too.
On the note of legitimacy of authority, there was a brief discussion of female teachers and violence being done against them. I was wondering if that was something that is only found in these contexts of illegitimacy of authority because of that state entering into it. Is there something that we can compare to understand that?
That's a really good question, and this has become a huge issue, the violence against female teachers. There were no female teachers, though, in the sort of age where there was Quranic school, and like it was only male teachers. Like there were no female school teachers ever at all. I mean, sometimes girls would go to those Quranic schools. It's not like it was just men and boys at those schools, but the girls were, so female teachers are a relatively new phenomenon that has come about with the advent of you know, the national education system and with women becoming much more educated, and having in the cities, having a lot of opportunities. But I think, I mean, there's a lot of violence against female teachers in urban contexts as well, especially in some of the peripheral neighborhoods.
I guess that was a portion of my question, is the extent of the ethnographic study and the idea of, is there instances where there isn't, where there is female teachers that are not from these national programs, that could be, that would then have that legitimacy of having the
Yeah.
community connection.
I don't think at this point with the national education system with primary schools that that's the case, but there may be individual neighborhood preschool programs, for example, where that is, and there actually are a lot of kind of neighborhood preschool programs that people sort of set up for in the cities, where it's a much more direct connection and it's a much more familial kind of kin base. And then there's, you have like women in religious school, like Morshida, like in mosque and religious contexts who are teaching, who are, I think are also kind of fulfilling that exchange in a slightly different way. I'm not sure if that, I don't have a lot of data on that, that's just kind of like my general impressions, but yeah.
I was just wondering about Steve Hawson,
Oh,
about, I guess, sort of where he grew up, how he became able to navigate this context of the discipline with the humor, if he kind of grew up around the region, or.
That's a really good question. I think he actually grew up in the South, but he grew up in a similar region, and so I mean, these practices go beyond, especially the teasing and the playing and the discipline, they go way beyond the rural context. So they're very familiar and recognizable in Morocco as a whole. And so I think I mean, it's just kind of infused into the child rearing system in some ways. And he was also a theater major in college, and so he was very performative and like really good at performance, and he loved to just like perform in front of a class. And so there was something very unique about him in terms of his ability to kind of connect with students that I don't think most teachers, I mean, he was really one of the most brilliant teachers I've ever seen, probably. I mean, he was just so, and he's actually ended up moving up in the hierarchy and is in a pretty prominent position in the Ministry of National Education, which was great, but.
Can I put an adjunct question for Jim?
Mm-hmm.
Jumps in, because it's in his classroom, getting to your primary question, what kind of person does this produce? That I was wondering, in Sitassi's classroom, maybe this is something you have a note on, a mental note, maybe it isn't. But I was wondering, how does the girl feel? How does she react when she sees the boy that hit her being lightly disciplined and then laughing as he walks to the corner? Does she feel like she that right has been carried out? Does she feel safer? I mean, it's so interesting. It's such an interesting case because what the boy has done is hit her. Right? And then back in the classroom, he doesn't get hit back. He you know, within a few seconds, it turns into, haha, I'm walking to the corner. And I'm just wondering if the girl is like, geez, you know.
You know, I haven't thought about that before, honestly, and I think that's a a good question. I mean, often in these contexts, like, boys are allowed to hit girls in the context of play. Girls are often encouraged to fight back against that too, though. I mean, it's not just like, oh, let anybody hit you. I mean, like, parents are like, no, go back out there and, you know,
but the
knock them
question
back or
we
something.
get at the heart of
I don't know how she felt.
how violence
Yeah.
and this sort of like attenuated violence,
Right.
you know, if you're talking about the effect on the whole
Yeah.
classroom, this
Right.
boy is like, hey, I didn't get hit, sweet.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I like this, it's okay,
Yeah.
I'm disciplined, but I didn't get, but is it possible that the girl is saying, I've got no recourse here, or, you know,
Right.
I don't know, it's, I think it gets.
No,
to the
I
heart
think
of what
that's
you're trying to
a
ask.
really good point. It's a very interesting, like, to think about too, like, as if new disciplinary practices were enacted where, you know, people aren't severely disciplined for things that they previously would have been, are there other people who could be harmed by that? Like, yeah.
Right.
No, it's
So I wanna, I'm trying to figure out like the whole moral story here. So like your question is what types of subjects is practice producing, but there's all this rich material about what they think, what types of subjects they think this practice is
Right.
producing. and there seem to be parallel moral arguments here. I'm just looking through my notes and some of the things you said, like the notion that it's about establishing appropriate orders of authority. I think teachers said that, and even some of the parents say that, right? There's the notion, I think, from the urban elites that education is critical to morality, which is critical to following the proper religion.
And rural people bring that.
And it's critical, also the rural do as well. It's critical to sort of building a notion of moral personhood. But then there's like, so the reformers are framing corporal punishment as a moral problem, we said. But then there's all this stuff that's being framed as corporal punishment as a moralizing force in society. So it seems to be there's sort of two sides of a moral argument going on there. And it's revolving around a very rich discourse, it seems, about this particular practice. But if the teachers are state actors, then they're sort of not legitimately using that practice to appropriately inculcate moral personhood, despite the fact that that might be consonant with the moral thing that they're working for. I mean, it's a very interesting story that has these, they're almost like trying to meet the same ends, but sometimes it's legitimate, sometimes it's not legitimate.
Yeah.
And then you have the reformers just trying to like say, this is all immoral. Right?
To like kind of bring a blanket statement, yeah.
And so I mean, I wonder what's at the heart of the sort of dissonant perspectives on this. I guess that's the part I'm not, I don't quite get, is like, what's at the heart of like reformers saying, framing corporal punishment as a moral problem, and yet this sort of rich discourse about how corporal punishment is the inculcation of moral personhood, or a critical element of the inculcation of moral personhood. Like, do they know, I guess, do they see each other as making different arguments about the cultivation of moral personhood, or?
I mean, I think they do, and I think they think that each other is wrong, you know. I think that the UNICEF people would recognize that discourse, you know.
So the reformers are pretty much just coming from
Well, the
UNICEF
reformers
standpoint.
are, okay, so.
So their notion of moral personhood coincides with like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or
Yes,
something like
exactly,
that.
and I think that there's a very elite class in Morocco who buys into that too, and who, you know, is associated with.
Western trained.
Yes, exactly, they're Western trained, the psychologists are all trained in France, you know.
So those are not the people who are saying education equals morality equals following proper religion.
I mean, they might, I don't think that they would necessarily think that that's wrong, you know. I don't think those two things are necessarily opposed. It's, the opposition is more that pain, like the pain in corporal punishment produces trauma versus pain in corporal punishment produces, you know, obedience, submission, but also strength and, you know, ambivalence, which are, you know, two different models of, it actually gets into things like pain, like what is the associate, and which I didn't get into here, but I do in the book. It's like, you know, what does pain produce, and like how is that shaped by social forces? Which pain, shame, you know, all of these things that corporal punishment supposedly produces.
I think it goes to a higher level in a lot of these countries, in that the political elite want to have their country be perceived by developed countries as meeting that supposed standard. And that goes a long ways also for qualifying for grants, for development grants. And so this is a whole nother aspect of, I mean, we have the same problem in Jordan where, you know, the political urban elite
Totally disconnected.
totally discount Bedouins being, you know, uneducatable, and there's all kinds of ways to enforce what the political elite perceive that they have to do to have their status, their identity as a Moroccan or a Jordanian or, you know, whatever, accepted by the Western elite.
Right.
And so much of that, I mean, for example, I don't know what they do in Morocco, but in Jordan, every governmental position, like police, they're not from the local community, they're from Tafila. Or they're brought in from the outside, and that's to reduce nepotism among the tribes and other reasons, but it's not that they're nurturing locals to do the education.
Right, no.
There's so many levels of control and imposition that are at direct confrontation with what local tradition
Right,
on every level.
yeah,
Yeah, well, I'd say that's the heart of it, when
Yeah.
you bring up Foucault. This is precisely disciplining.
Right,
And so, I mean,
exactly.
this is, you know, no
Incomplete
shock and
discipline.
awe,
Yeah,
right? But there's something, in some ways, in many ways, much more insidious and going on. And the state is saying, well, look, you know, like you can shear a sheep a lot of times, but skin them only once. So if we're having like people, you know, get hit and then they rebel, and that's as opposed to sort of subtly incorporating them into these disciplinary practices
Right.
where we can really harness their biopower, as opposed to risk them
right.
rebelling against us.
Right.
And but I mean, here's where these two, like Jake was saying, these two discourses are interestingly symmetrical in a lot of ways, because of course what Foucault is arguing is that yes, this is insidious and it gets into all of us, and we're sort of in these networks that we don't realize, you know, power from all these directions, but precisely because of that, we have power to be able to push back against
Right,
these things, and that sounds like what the discourse on violence is. It makes you strong, it makes you obedient, it makes you be able to resist things better.
So
It makes you
there's-
not wimpy, that sort of thing.
There's a very strong and powerful tie-in right here. I think actually we were talking a little bit about the new anthropology of morality stuff. That, so James Laidlaw in his recent book, The Subject of Virtue, he has, I think, just a beautiful rereading of Foucault, and argues that the late Foucault stuff, particularly like the technologies of the self, thinking more sort of reflectively about the practices that we turn in on ourselves to cultivate ourselves as particular types of persons, has a very explicitly and interestingly agentic and reflective element to it. And it seems like this is very powerfully coming out in your data. And it's, you know, you're talking about engaging with Vina Das. It strikes me that you have a good ethnographic story that kind of like says, you know, there's something more than ordinary ethics going on here. There is actually a very rich, discursive way in which people are talking about literally the disciplining practices of cultivating the person, which the thing I like about Laidlaw's rereading of Foucault is it really kind of says that a lot of those the practice theory and maybe some ordinary ethics type of interpretations are really kind of getting Foucault wrong, or at least only getting one side of Foucault and completely ignoring that other more reflective sort of technologies of the self side, to use some really ugly terminology, but actually, anyway, but I think there's a very, my advisor told me I struck that term out of my dissertation proposal, so I still talked about it because it's useful stuff, but it's kind of some ugly terminology. But anyway, you have a very rich and interesting story about that, the reflective nature of those disciplining practices and how, I mean, people are having an argument, it seems, about it, right? And actually reflectively engaging in how we are cultivating subjects.
Yeah, it's not so new. I mean, Pierre Adot and Arnold Davidson, you know, Foucault himself is talking about like the exercises of St. Ignatius and, you know, as you know, developing the self, making the self better, improving the self, these practices that one imposes on oneself.
although I'm not sure it's so explicit, right? And I think it's
Sure.
like somebody was saying, like it's much more associated with these other, I mean, it's not just corporal punishment, it's like all this other stuff too. Corporal punishment and all of these other,
It's a standing for backwardness. And
yeah,
for,
yeah. But it-
untrainability. and-
right. But it's also all of these other, you know, ideas about women's rights and, I mean, corporal punishment is one of the, about health, you know, like medicine, like how you should be, how your body should conform to modern medicine, these kinds of things. I think that
I guess I'm
it's
just
all
thinking-
part and parcel of that same kind of imposition of NGO development work on the village versus, you know, kind of, that it completely ignores the local tradition, even when it's being kind of promoted by Moroccans who are often elite. Like they would come in to talk about women's rights, and they would just speak Fusha, which is the modern standard Arabic that nobody can understand, and they would just literally sit in front of the room. No one would understand them because this is like the kind of formal Arabic, and talk to the women about their rights in a language they could not understand. Even though these women could have, these performers could have spoken, you know, the dialect, they knew the dialect, they could have done that. That was just their MO. And so that's sort of kind of like a metaphor like of how state development works, is like they don't really.
Can I just try and think through one of the points here? Maybe you were making this perfectly clearly, and I'll just restate it and see if this makes sense. So is one of the arguments here that the type of subject that corporal punishment produces, which you called somebody who's ambivalent towards authority, right? That there's pain at the authority, right? So this is that Foucauldian moment with Damien's, right? And everybody's seeing, right? That creates ambivalence towards authority. And then the problem with that for a state then is a state doesn't want a subject who is ambivalent towards authority. And so that you can't have the teachers that are sent by the state doing that because of this problem of discipline and relationship to the state. And so is that the argument that you're getting to with this ambivalence towards authority and the problematic nature of it? And of course, nation states would want that, right? They would not want ambivalence towards authority. They would want a different sort of relationship to the state.
Kind of like absolute authority, although.
Well, not absolutely, they want to internalize.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It's so routinized and so,
Right.
so normalized and cellularized that everybody just does it.
It's
Just
a
obey.
process of the state trying to become the patriarch. It's a process of creating a nation, concept of a nation state that supersedes local, village, and tribal stuff that's gone on for thousands of years, and it's not necessarily working. And I guess my concern is maybe what you're seeing as I would take question with the ambivalence thing, that this is creating ambivalence. Because I don't know what the experience is in this village, but in other villages that I'm familiar with, you're talking about the end product, and the end product isn't necessarily, what I'm seeing is a lot as early adults and adults, is not people that are ambivalent about authority, but rather, but not aggressive, but they're still tied into this tribal paradigm of conciliation among one another, trying to
That's
find.
true.
They're not creating hostile individuals in the sense that you're kind of talking about. And the ambivalence to authority may be more of ambivalence to authority of the central government versus the authority of the elders of the village or the elders of the tribe or your father. But these are also societies where elders are respected, elders are taken care of when they get older. There's a huge, strong extended family connection. There are functions that are happening here that are not, that I'm not seeing in what you're presenting.
So, and I mean, I guess that's partly because I didn't present some
Right.
of that data here about the actual household interactions, which is really where I get into the end of it. I kind of glossed over it with the humor and the play and how that's
Right.
integrated into that. But I mean, what I would see in the household in terms of the ambivalence is that people were very ambivalent towards their parents, towards their kin, you know, and were constantly, even, you know, they would talk about, yes, it's good to take care of your elders, but when it came down to it, often had extremely conflictual relationships with the kin. I mean, it's very, very common and kind of, I mean, that they're I mean, that's part of the criticism of these like rural Moroccans. It's like, oh, they just are, they're always in conflict with each other. But I mean, it's like a matter of resource, you know, like lack of resources, for example.
And it's
I mean,
also
a
the
huge problem.
disjunction one. I see the ambivalence as really parallel
Yeah.
in the same thing as the legitimacy.
Yeah.
In other words, the ambivalence is echoed when I ask, are these kids' testimonies reliable when they say this? Or, I mean, in other words, it seems to me that they're just reflecting the exact same ambivalence about school, but we have teachers sent in from elsewhere, and, you know, if you know, let's say, dial back the clock however many years, and if it were just in a communal environment, a community environment, that there would be much less ambivalence about violence, and, you know, because there would be the codes would be much more understood by all people involved, but violence, insofar as it's a node here of articulation between sort of foreign power, central government comes in us, and they try to teach us stuff in language that we don't understand, and you can't hit my kid. That what this does is it creates, I suggest that it's creating that, this is where the ambivalence comes from, is that, well, how am I supposed to feel about being disciplined?
And I think that I sort of think it's been even heightened, but I do think even before, I mean, so there's been a lot of anthropologists like Elaine Combe-Schillings and Abdullah Hamoudi who've talked about because the Moroccan state, it's a monarchy, right, too, and so people have a certain relationship towards the state, but they have almost a different relationship towards the monarch, right? People, especially in these rural areas, people love the monarch, like they love their king, right? And they see him as part of their family. It's a very, I don't want to get into the whole complexity of how does the idea is that, you know, that the patriarchy and the family supports the patriarchy of the king. And so, but that patriarchy, and in demanding absolute submission, you're promised the possibility as a man to become a patriarch at some point. And so you're always sort of, I mean, this is what Combe-Schilling and Hamoudi argue, is that you're always sort of, you know, feeling, wanting to be a patriarch, but also, you know, feeling kind of ambivalent about having to be submissive at the same time and embody two roles, and that's sort of where and I look at it from a slightly different angle too, because I think that's too gendered in some ways, and that there's something about
It's too
the
culture heavy.
yeah, and
And
it's
never in Arab society has been a sense for males to be submissive to anybody.
right.
Because, you know, no matter, there's always this very, you know, just pecking order. But no matter what social level you're in, you have access to state your case. And expectations of justice at whatever level that happens to be, all the way up to the king. And in most countries that are monarchies in the Islamic world, that's still the case. You can still appeal to the king. But they're the lowest, you know, social economic level possible. It's not, submission is not a proper word in that culture.
But I think in the Moroccan
No Arab
context,
would accept that term.
but I think in the Moroccan context, it really is a key idea about, you know, the it's a key feeling, this idea of being oppressed is very common amongst the young
Well,
people.
you're talking about 12-year-old,
Yeah,
13-year-old males that are being hit by their fathers, right?
Exactly.
And so they're like,
But even the kids too, I mean,
know.
the kids are being expected to go out and defend themselves and be strong, and so there's a certain, then being, you know, smacked down to some extent. It doesn't feel like embodying those two positions is, there's a conflict there, there's a psychological conflict, I think, that a lot of these kids experience, and I could see it in their subsequent relationships with their parents, which were very, you know, it was not like, there was a constant negotiation too with the parents over discipline, over, you know, this kinds of
So I get to have the last word here, which is, we do have to wrap up, but the thing that I wanted to mention that I think is really interesting, and maybe we can chat over dinner, we have a spot for 2 students, I'd say, for dinner, by the way, if people are interested. Let me know after. But one thing that I see that's really interesting is the payment to the way that teachers are paid. Because there's something that in South Korea maps exactly onto this, which is, and I didn't realize it until just now, that there, along with this banning of corporal punishment in South Korea and Seoul, there has been also this major change. There was also a banning of, they call it, I can't remember what the term is, it's basically like your finger, it's where you give a gift to the parent, to the teacher. The parents give gifts, and these used to be very substantial. And actually, a long time ago, it was the case that the teachers lived off of these gifts from parents, essentially. So over time, you've seen that sort of go down.
Oh, interesting.
And it actually got banned somewhere around 10 years ago, close to the time of corporal punishment. So you see this interesting relationship between parents and teachers that is getting realigned, so that teachers are no longer the in loco parentis, but are become agents of the state. And that when that happens, that perhaps that has something to do with the banning of corporal punishment, since the state has this problem of not being able to beat kids and sort of get away with it, right? So it's just a little hypothesis.
That's very
which we
interesting.
can talk about later. But anyway, let's thank Christine for.
Thank you for all your thoughtful comments and questions.
You know, I'm not sure how I feel about ambulance.
Are you ready for that one?
We got 5 minutes.